I don't have a remote. Well, good to see each of you here this morning. We're going to be continuing our study in the book of Acts today. Acts chapter 15. We know that conflicts happen in life. Sometimes we are unable to see eye to eye with another person on a particular issue. Sometimes conflicts come from misunderstanding or poor communication, and whatever it may be, sometimes those things happen, problems with other people, and we know that we will encounter them at different points. But how is it that we handle the conflict? And of course, like anything, we look at the New Testament to teach us about those things. So when you think about some examples of conflict, I want us to consider a couple of the apostles that I think are interesting to think about. Simon the Zealot and Levi the tax collector. When you think about the friends of Jesus, the people that he befriended, you know that there's a man named Levi, or better known as the apostle Matthew, who was a tax collector. And just think about that. I mean, of course, tax collectors were known to be considered traitors to the Jewish cause. They're known to be thieves and extortioners, and they are classified by the Jews as right up there with prostitutes and in society. And tax collectors were a hated group of people by the Jews. And we know that and understand that. But think about the contrast with someone like Simon the Zealot. That wasn't his first and last name. That's who he was, Simon the Zealot. And I think we can see the gravity of the background in someone called that. A zealot's background is one that's pretty serious. The Expositor's Bible commentary states that a zealot was one who had advocated revolutionary opposition to Rome. Another one states that zealots advocate the overthrow of Rome by force. Josephus, of course, a Jewish historian, he said that zealots resorted to violence and assassination in their hatred of the foreigner. Vincent, in his Word Studies book, says that zealots were a sect which stood for the recovery of Jewish freedom and the maintenance of distinctive Jewish institutions. So I just want us to think about for just a moment that political spectrum that's involved here in Jesus' selection of just two of the apostles. One worked for the Roman government, taxed the Jewish people unfairly while he lined his own pockets. Another apostle hated all that the Roman Empire would have stood for, believed in the overthrow of Rome, and perhaps one day maybe even have wanted to revolt against that Roman power and be a part of that. One apostle agrees with the Romans. Another one hates the Romans. One apostle accepted the Roman position of power in Judea and profited from it, and another would be willing to do anything, maybe even give his life, to get rid of the Roman authority. So it's not really a stretch to think about conflict and how that would have gone, how that would have been seen, how it would have existed from the first day these two would have been introduced to one another. It's not hard to envision that what might have been going through their minds as they learned that they were on opposite ends of the spectrum, but they had a greater calling. They had been called to follow Jesus. So I think that's a pretty interesting thing to consider. But think about Paul and Barnabas. We don't have to wonder. It's not speculation whether there's conflicts or not, as we don't see all of that I just talked about with Simon and with Matthew, but it's there. It's just not really talked about in any kind of detail. We don't have to wonder about Paul and Barnabas because the record here at the end of Acts chapter 15 shows us that there definitely is a conflict that goes on. Paul has a desire to go back with Barnabas to the cities that they've been to previous to see how the disciples are doing from where they have been before. Barnabas is determined to take John Mark with them on this journey. He had, of course, gone with Paul and Barnabas on the first journey, but in chapter 13 and verse 13 returns to Jerusalem pretty early on in the trip. It's Barnabas's expectation that he's going to go with them again on this journey. But Paul insists that they should not take John Mark with them because he had left them before. Verse 39 tells us there is a sharp disagreement, a sharp dispute that is taking place here. And again, you don't really have to speculate a whole lot on what that looked like, why there would be such a dispute. We don't really have to wonder what the disagreement was. Barnabas says, well, John Mark went with us last time, and he's going to do better this time, and we should take him. And Mark's ready to go. But Barnabas isn't bothered by the fact that he left him. He wants to give him another chance. Let him go back with us. Paul doesn't want Mark to come. Mark left early on. He left before things got difficult. He left before the persecutions really started. Mark had not seen the Jews of Antioch of Pisidia chase them through the cities of Asia Minor, persecuting them. Mark had not seen what happened in Lystra whenever Paul was stoned and dragged out of the city and left for dead. Mark wasn't there for that. If Mark bailed on them on the first journey before it even got tough, why do we want him to come back? Why are we going to let this happen again? Why is that going to be any different than it was last time whenever Mark didn't see any of this? What happens now if we let him come and the real persecution starts? Some interesting things to think about along those lines. So who's right? Who's right in that situation? Well, the answer is that there's not really a wrong. They're both right. They're both correct. Both those opinions are valid. Both those views are truthful. Nobody's making up a story. Nobody's got an axe to grind. Nobody's trying to change the circumstances to suit the situation. I mean, those are just the facts. And in verses 39 through 41, we read about the solution that Paul and Barnabas arrive at for this problem. They end up dividing up the territory, and they go separately. Barnabas takes Mark. They go to Cyprus. They're going to see how the disciples are doing down there. Paul takes Silas. They go through Syria and Cilicia and strengthen the churches in that direction. So, we see a resolution that takes place there. We also see the reason for disputes. And we see that and understand that people have different backgrounds. They have different values. They have different perceptions on details. And from time to time, these kind of conflicts can arise, and we don't necessarily see things the same way. Nobody's a robot. Nobody does everything identically. And we shouldn't make decisions or decide that somehow everybody is just going to see eye to eye on every single thing when we have different values, perceptions, and backgrounds. But what do we do about that? How do we deal with those kinds of conflicts that might come up? And how are we going to do that and remain pleasing and obedient to our God? That's what we're going to talk about a little bit this morning. So first, consider what not to do. What should you not do? What do we not see here in these kinds of conflicts? It is interesting that Paul and Barnabas do not drag the church at Antioch into the dispute as they have it out with each other. We don't see that taking place. Paul and Barnabas don't turn this sharp disagreement into a drama for the church at Antioch to sort out. The problem remains with them, and they're working through that dispute. How often do we pull other people into things that are not really their business? If you have a conflict in your marriage, probably it's not a good idea to drag everybody else into it and think that that's going to help sort out the problem. You need to deal with it, of course, but that would not be the way to do that. If you have a conflict in a friendship, you don't drag in every other friend you've ever had to try to come to some sort of an understanding for them to weigh in on what they think about one thing or another. I'm not saying that it's not a place of mediation sometimes, but that's not what we're talking about here. What those kinds of things do is they break trust. And in a friendship, you can break trust in that relationship by going elsewhere, telling other people about the problems, especially if there's not an agreement to do so. The same is true in a marriage. You're going to break trust in the marriage if you're going to just go to everybody else, talk to them about the problems. That's not the way that those things should be handled. Something else, the cold shoulder or lashing out. We can find ourselves acting outside of what Christ would prefer if we're going to lash out at others or give people the cold shoulder, thinking that somehow is going to be helpful in resolving those kinds of things. You know, do we really think that in an attempt to hurt somebody's feelings or to make a point to someone that is going to be the way we would handle those kinds of things? Jesus, of course, did not act like that, nor is venting really a very good idea either. But those are just not things we find in the scriptures of those that would be righteous or acceptable, and certainly not something that we see Paul and Barnabas doing here. We can sometimes complain about our situation many times. If we don't have the things worked out the way we would like, we can complain about what's happened. And I mean, can you imagine our situation with Paul and Barnabas? I'm sure Paul went to Asia Minor talking about how unreasonable Barnabas was and how he wanted to take John Mark and how ridiculous. I mean, you know, that didn't happen. Paul would not have done that. Barnabas wasn't going through Cyprus telling the disciples how awful Paul was because he wanted to bring somebody with them that had deserted him the last time and how he didn't want Mark there with. No, that's not what he was doing. And I know we can easily understand, okay, that's not what they were doing, but why would we do that? Why would we make sure that other people know what someone else did to us or paint others as doing something terrible? Again, not very Christ-like, not acting like Christians in those regards. So what should we do then if there's conflicts that arise? Well, certainly we need to try to work those things out. We have to realize that we can be wrong. And that's a big step sometimes, thinking in that way. Now, we would like to think that our opinions are always right and that we always have perfect knowledge and understanding of everything and that how we view a situation is always correct. But that's probably not very realistic, is it? That's a little bit more of an egotistical type of attitude that's going to keep us from finding resolution and a common ground. Too often we just want to be right, and we will misuse scripture, we'll do whatever it takes in order to make sure we feel justified in what we're doing, whenever we should be sincerely trying to work through our conflicts. This situation in Acts chapter 15, this wasn't just a small conversation. It wasn't a matter of Barnabas saying that he didn't want to take Mark and Paul saying, I do, and then they go their separate ways. This sharp disagreement they have, indicates there was a long conversation about this. That this was an ongoing type of discussion. It wasn't just a one and done conversation that just resulted in this kind of split. This was something that turned into a sharp dispute. So we do need to try to work things out. We must attempt for there to be a solution that we can work through. Sometimes there are things that should be overlooked. I'm not saying that everything does, of course. That would be ridiculous. But sometimes we may not see eye to eye on something, and not everybody's coming from our point of view. We don't come from everybody else's point of view. Sometimes the answer seems clear from our vantage point, but sometimes we're not looking at the other person's vantage point. When Paul talks about looking out for the best interest of others in Philippians chapter 2, he is talking about the need to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, to think about it from their perspective, look at it from their situation. Many times the reason for conflict is because we're not looking at somebody else's situation. We're not trying to come from where they're coming from. And so sometimes we don't see it that way. But sometimes there are issues that are small enough, they just need to be overlooked and not be made into a big issue. Sometimes we need to move forward. I'm not always going to be able to change somebody's mind. You're not always going to be able to change someone's mind as well. Are we arrogant to think that everybody has to change their mind about every single thing? Are we so egotistical that we think our wisdom is going to change everybody else's mind about every single thing? We're going to have the ability to let some things go sometimes. I mean, I personally would love if everybody saw my perspective and believed everything I said every single time, but it's probably not very realistic. And obviously everybody else is wrong because of that, right? But am I going to sever all relationships? Am I going to cut everybody off if there's a disagreement or if somebody doesn't see it exactly the way I want them to? Is that license to treat everybody badly that doesn't see things the way that I think they should? Or can we sometimes just move forward and let some things go in those kinds of situations? We need to be united under a common cause. I realize not everybody's going to see everything alike, and there's going to be some things we disagree on. But, not everything is a fellowship issue. Not everything is an issue of salvation. There's plenty of those. Don't get me wrong. There's plenty of those, but not everything is. And we see that with Paul and Barnabas here. They disagreed about what to do with Mark, but what did they do? They united under a common cause. Their desire to help these new disciples in these different cities. The disciples didn't go without because Paul and Barnabas had a dispute. Quite the opposite. Paul and Barnabas worked together to do the work of the Lord through this disagreement, and it wasn't going to stop them from doing the work that needed to be done. And I believe in the same way, that's what Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector had to do as well. They would have disagreed upon very many things involving the current Roman government and how it affected Judaism and Christianity and all of that, but they would have had to unite under a common cause of following Jesus. And that's pretty important for us to think about. There's been disagreements between congregations where, people dissuade others from going to visit another congregation. I mean, that's an individual choice. And yet we see those kinds of things take place. There's been disagreements in congregations where people leave, people start attending different denominations, they start attending very liberal churches because they're unhappy with an opinion. Those kinds of things happen as well. Do we think that is a very good solution to problems? Or in everything that's done, somebody makes a threat, you're going to do it this way or else. Somebody is going to cause problems. And, if we think we're going to have to be in agreement on every opinion, or if fellowship is going to be determined by every single little thing as well, you're going to end up with a church of one, because that's what happens when you would insist on these kinds of things. One last point this morning, and that is, remember Paul's words here about better to be defrauded than really to make a point. In 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 7, why not rather be wronged, he says. Why not rather be defrauded? He's talking about taking your brother to court. He's talking about suing your brother, having a lawsuit against your brother. Is there not a wise person among you, he says? Why not be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? Instead of always trying to be right, maybe we can let something go. Maybe we don't have to go down that path. We may be right, but Paul says it might be better just to be wronged instead. It might be better to be wrong and let something like that not go to court. Let something like that not be such an invasive issue. We may be right in dealing with a conflict in our marriage, but it might be better off just to be wrong and not have it be something that's bigger than that. We may demand to be right in our relationships, but that's just going to lead to a severing of those things. Why not rather be wronged than let it come to those things? In some of these matters like that, what does it really hurt other than our pride? And therein lies a lot of the problem. We know how to resolve conflicts. The problem is we often are more interested in having it our way or doing things a certain way rather than fixing the issue. We want to justify ourselves, our thoughts, and we can do any number of things to make sure that we come out on top. But that's not really what the point should be. It should be trying to resolve conflict, working together, and even at the point of being treated unfairly, it's more important that we are united in Christ than it is to do all these other things. God knows our hearts. He sees our actions. He knows what we're thinking about and what our focus really is. And of course, we will be judged accordingly. But this is such a small text here at the end of Acts chapter 15, but it is so powerful to get you to think about what it would have looked like if this sharp dispute would have led to a cessation of the preaching of the gospel, or what this sharp dispute could have turned into. And yet, ultimately, it turns into two groups of preaching that went on. Two groups of men that went on proclaiming the gospel and strengthening the brethren. And so it actually ends up being, in a lot of ways, more positive than what it could have been otherwise. Let's learn a lesson from that as we think about these kinds of things and understand the severity of what it is we're up against. We have the world, we have trying to follow Jesus, working together in that relationship, trying to come to better understandings, trying to grow in our faith and knowledge and understanding of the Lord, and above all, trying to get to heaven and trying to do so in the very best that we can with working with other people. This morning, if we can help in any way in getting your life right with the Lord, you have the opportunity to change that. If you're not a Christian, it starts by becoming one, by putting your faith and trust in the Lord, seeking Him for salvation, for forgiveness, and understanding that the Lord wants us with Him for eternity. He wants to forgive us, wants us to be a part of His family, and when this life on earth is over, He wants us to be there with Him for all time. If we can help you this morning anyway, we'd like to do that. If you let it be known by coming forward, together we stand and sing.
When the trumpet shall sound and the dead shall arise, and the splendor immortal shall envelop the skies, when the angel of death shall no longer destroy, and the dead shall awaken in the morning of joy. In the morning of joy, in the morning of joy, we'll be gathered to glory. In the morning of joy, in the morning of joy, in the morning of joy, we'll be gathered to glory. In the morning of joy, when the King shall appear into me on high, and shall summon His children to the courts of the sky, shall the calls of the Lord, and in all your employ, that your soul may be spotless in the morning of joy. In the morning of joy, in the morning of joy, we'll be gathered to glory. In the morning of joy, in the morning of joy, in the morning of joy, we'll be gathered to glory. In the morning of joy. Oh, the bliss of that morn, when the saved ones we meet, with the songs of the ransom each other shall greet, singing praise to the Lamb, through eternity. morning of joy, in the morning of joy, we'll be gathered to glory in the morning of